Hello, students. This is Mr. Martyrum with your Flip Classroom on the introduction to the French Revolution. So in this video, we're going to talk about on the eve of a revolution. So in your French Revolution Flip Classroom packet, we are going to answer questions 1 through 9. And if I go too fast, you can always pause the video, or if you need to watch it again, feel free to do so. So we're not at the French Revolution just yet. So I want to give you a little bit of background. So as we head into the French Revolution, you have to understand that everybody in France fit into one of these three categories. Does this look familiar? Well, if you guessed feudalism, you'd be correct. It does. It looks similar. It's not exactly, but it looks similar to the feudal pyramid. France was organized into what are called estates. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the nobility, and then the third estate was the everyone else category. So the first estate was the clergy, and the clergy owned about 10% of the land. They collected taxes, and they did not pay any taxes directly to the government. All right, sounds like a pretty sweet deal. But the problem is, if they're not paying taxes, where does the tax burden fall? Well, it's going to fall to the people in the second estate and the third estate. And as we're going to see, do you think the nobility pays taxes? Not a whole lot. So the people up at the top of the third estate, they're paying the least amount. The people in the nobility are going to pay a little bit more, and then everyone else is going to pay a lot. As a result of this, the enlightened thinkers and philosophers begin to target the first estate. Because remember, we're still dealing in the 1700s, we're still dealing with the idea of absolutism. So a lot of people in the clergy are saying that they get their ideology, they get their authority to govern from God. And people down at the bottom, the enlightened thinkers like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and Montesquieu, they're saying that may not be the case. And as a result, a lot of the clergy members are kind of condemning the people in the third estate and the everyone else category. So what I hope you guys understand from this, or at least you remember, is that there's still this influence of the impact of science. We're not too far removed from the Protestant Reformation and the scientific revolution, where a lot of these new ways of thinking really challenged the old guard in the clergy. So what about the people in the middle, the nobles, what's known as the second estate? So the nobles hold top jobs in government, the army, and the courts. Not bad. They own land, but they don't have a whole lot of income. So they're making money, but they're not super wealthy like the clergy is. Here's the problem. As revolution begins to break out, and I want you guys to understand, French Revolution just didn't happen overnight. It happens very slowly. So as people are moving towards revolution, where do the people in the nobility fall? Do they say, you know what, we're going to play it safe and stick with the clergy, and we don't have an ideal situation, but it's better than, turning the whole country into chaos? Or do they say, you know what, we want more land, we want more money, we want to redistribute wealth? And do they join the everyone else category? So they are in a bit of a pickle. So now let's focus on the third estate, because this is where the rebellion really begins. And this is known as the third estate, or the everyone else category. And the everyone else category was a very diverse group. Atop of the third estate sat a group called the bourgeoisie, followed by the group called the rural peasants, and then the poorest members. So the bourgeoisie included jobs such as bankers, merchants, manufacturers, lawyers, and doctors. What you and I would consider upper class jobs today, or at least upper middle class, they would be the top of the bottom. So again, I want you guys to think about that and say, well, that's how tremendous the distribution of wealth was. It was very inadequate and very unfair. Beneath the bourgeoisie sat the rural peasants. So these are farmers who are working outside of Paris. They make up a good majority of the third estate. And then you have the poorest members, the urban poor. These are city workers, many of whom were unemployed and turned to a life of crime. Well, why do they turn to a life of crime? They turn to a life of crime because who's paying the most amount of taxes? Well, let's take a look at question number 3. The minor problem facing France is this. The third estate resented the privileges of the first and second estate. The best jobs were reserved for the nobility, and the fact that the third estate had to pay the highest tax burden. So what's happening is the people with the least are paying the most. And now you have ideas of the Enlightenment trickling in to the third estate. And now they want equality. They want tax equality. And the people in the third estate are keenly aware that, look right across the ocean to the American Revolution. The colonists fought for taxation to be represented, and they won their revolution. So now we're seeing this idea of equality spread throughout. So the minor problem facing France, this is question 4, here's the tax breakdown. The first estate pays 1% of the taxes. The second estate pays 2%. And as you can imagine, 97% of the taxes is paid by the poorest members. Now, we said in a previous slide that these men and women turned to a life of begging and a life of crime. Well, what crime were they actually committing? Because in many cases, and this is where I make the famous reference to Les Miserables, in a lot of cases, members of French society were stealing bread. They were stealing food to feed their families. They were not stealing for luxuries, they were stealing and committing crimes of necessity, which I'm not going to argue whether it makes it right or wrong, but it paints a very gross picture of the inequities in France in 1789. So I want to talk just a little bit about what do we have for what's the point of taxes? So why was France in such a financial crisis? Well, they were in a financial crisis in part because of something called deficit spending. Right? And deficit spending is when a government spends more money than it brings in. I don't want to talk a lot about deficit spending right now, but I want you to put a little star or highlight that definition because we are going to talk about it in class. It's an important concept for your personal finances, and it's an important concept for understanding governmental finances. So how do we balance the budget? How do we get ourselves out of debt? So the government has a couple options. They can raise taxes or decrease spending, or they can do both. When you guys try to balance a budget, there's no easy winner. The nobles, they don't want to end their tax-free status, so they don't want to pay more, and certainly the clergy doesn't, and you can't tax the poor anymore. So there's this problem looming towards Louis XIV. Additionally, in the summer of 1789, there was a bad harvest. And as a result, as we've seen with Adam Smith, when you have a bad harvest, meaning the price of bread had to go up because farmers needed to make a profit so they could make a living. So now you have a situation where the poorest members of society, they can't afford to pay their taxes. They can't even afford necessities to survive. And now you're telling them that the price of food has increased and gone up and risen. They can't afford to live in Paris and France any longer. So now we're coming to a tipping point in France. The financial crisis of 1798 is a key catalyst for the French Revolution. So additional problems facing France. Okay? The Estates General. So what is the Estates General? And we're on question number 6 for those of you keeping up. So the Estates General is the name of the government in France. So in 1789, Louis XVI, grandson of Louis XIV, he summons the Estates General. It's the first time since 1614 that they meet. They all meet together as one. Louis XVI asks each of the representatives from the estates to write down their concerns in a leather-bound book called a carrière, which is where they just write all their grievances, everything that's going wrong. And there are many. This does not go well. As you can imagine, anytime you tell people to tell you, what are you doing that you don't like, it's sure to be a complaint fest. So as a result of this, Louis is in some trouble. Okay, and let's talk about that trouble. So you have the Estates General meeting, which is the government of France. You have the first estate trying to maintain their status. You have the second estate trying to maintain their tax-free status. But the third estate, they want changes. So all of these lawyers and middle-class officials, they go to Versailles to try and solve the financial crisis. So each estate has one vote. So the first estate has one vote, the second estate has a vote, and the third estate has a vote. This was obviously unfair because the first and second estate can very easily outvote the third estate, and it will always be a 2-to-1 vote. So now, the third estate, looking at the U.S. form of government, says, well, wait a minute. Why don't we base it off of population? We are the third estate. We have the most people. We should have the bigger say in government. This does not go well. So as a result, the third estate leaves the Estates General, and they form something called the National Assembly. They form their own government, and they invite the delegates from the new estates to join their new government. So basically, the members from the third estate left the government of France. They left the Estates General to form the National Assembly. Louis XVI is now losing control of his government. So delegates of the National Assembly, or the Third Estate, are locked out of the Estates General, and they're ordered by the king to leave. But they stay in a tennis court. I mean, it's basically a squash court on Versailles, and they take an oath. And this is question 7. They take an oath that they will not stop meeting until they draft a constitution. It's known as the tennis court oath. So now the Estates General, which was the government of France, is gone. And now we have what's called the National Assembly. The clergy and the nobility are invited to set up this new National Assembly, and some members show up. But as a result, King Louis, who is not a strong monarch, is forced to accept the assembly. And as a result, he will send the French military into Paris to enforce law and order. Now, we've discussed this in class before. What happens when you send armed forces, armed troops, armed guards into a hostile environment? It's a disaster waiting to happen. And that's what happens. And it happens on June 14th. But before I go on to storming the Bastille, I just want to take a point of clarification. If you look at question 8, where it says, what is the National Assembly? I'm just going to back up one second. So if you could paraphrase in your own words, what is the National Assembly? Well, the National Assembly, very simply, is the new government of France. It goes from the Estates General to the National Assembly. So now that there is a new guard, now we can talk about this great crisis, what's known as Bastille Day, July 14th, 1789. So what is the Bastille? So the Bastille is a massive dungeon that was used to torture enemies of the king. It represented absolutism. Parisians assembled outside the Bastille demanding weapons and gunpowder so they could defend themselves against the king's guard. This does not go well. Shots are fired, and before we know it, the Parisians are now storming the Bastille, tearing it down brick by brick. The commander of the Bastille gives the order to fire. 98 people are killed. 5 guards were killed. The mob enters the fortress, and they cut off the head of the guy in charge of the Bastille. And this symbol of cutting people's heads off and parading them around on pikes very quickly becomes the symbol of the French Revolution. And this is a big concept to understand because up to this point, the situation had been growing. And now with July 14th, with the storming of the Bastille, this now brings a new age of violence into the French Revolution. And the revolution begins. So July 14th, Bastille Day, is simply known as the beginning of the French Revolution. All right. I know that was a lot of information to unpack, but we're going to have a great class discussion about deficit spending and some of the evolution of France's government. If you feel like I went too fast and you need to rewatch the video, feel free to do so. If you have any questions, you can post them onto Google Classroom, and I will be happy to answer them. Otherwise, wait for further instructions before moving on to video number 2.